Now initially when the PlayStation 5 Pro launched, it got ragged on for being way too expensive. Surely for $700 somebody could easily make a 4K gaming PC that can rival its fidelity and overall frame rate. But is that really the case? Well, today in this video, we're going to be building two gaming systems. One is going to be similarly priced to the PS5 Pro at $700. The other one is going to be slightly above. The cheaper gaming PC is going to be powered by an AMD 5600X processor, as well as an RTX 3060 Ti. Now, I understand that the GPU on the PS5 Pro is more similar to the 7800 XT from AMD. Those are typically more expensive, and I didn't want to skimp on our CPU or to get too much into the used world of PC parts. So mostly with newer components, I found that the best bang for the buck right now was probably going to be the RTX 3060 Ti, especially for Quad HD gaming and even 4K gaming. It's more than adequate for most gaming titles, but let's see how the GPU fares up against the PlayStation 5 Pro. The other PC is going to be more expensive than the PS5 Pro. I want to specifically make a small form factor gaming PC that I can take to the theater room that I have to play on my 77-inch OLED, something that could easily do 4K 60 frames per second, no problem, with little to no compromises. So to do that, we paired an Intel 14600K processor with an RTX 4070 Ti Super and stuffed it into the Fractal Ridge. This $1,600 gaming system should be far superior than the PlayStation 5 Pro on paper, but let's see how true that is on our benchmark results. But the first thing that we're going to take a look at is the overall price point as well as parts breakdown of each of these gaming PCs, and then we're going to take a look at our benchmark results in terms of frame rate and fidelity of the PC and the PlayStation 5 Pro. Now before we get into our PCs, I do want to mention the core specs on the PS5 Pro. Now we know for a fact that the CPU is pretty much the same as the standard PlayStation 5. It's still using Zen 2 architecture with 8 cores and 16 threads, and the frequency range is about 3.5 to about 3.8 gigahertz, and it's on the whole about 10% faster than the original PS5 console. The GPU is where we have the biggest upgrade. It's probably running some sort of 8000 series RX card, like an 8600 XT, but we don't know exactly for sure. The compute units is about 60, and equivalently that makes it quite similar to the RX 7800 XT with probably a lower core clock as well as memory clock. But we still get 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 like the 7800 XT, as well as the same 256-bit memory bus, but we do have greater bandwidth on the 7800 XT with 624.1 gigabytes a second versus 576 gigabytes a second on the PlayStation 5 Pro. Now, brand new 7800 XT is about $450 on Amazon. You can obviously get it cheaper at other places, and certainly if you buy it used, that would be a good option. But since we want to make a pretty good holistic system with a good balance of CPU and GPU performance, I think our combination of the RTX 3060 Ti, although probably won't be as fast as a 7800 XT, but in combination with the 5600X processor is going to give us pretty decent results. Now, if you look on Amazon, you can find an RTX 3060 Ti for around $300, but I would definitely recommend looking at Facebook Marketplace or eBay. I specifically got this Zotac 3060 Ti for only $180 off of Facebook. Of course, we're not going to be factoring that specific used price point since that's not really fair, so we're going to be counting our grand total on what is readily available on Amazon. Now, you could obviously get a 4060, but those are typically not as powerful as the 3060 Ti. It'd be probably better to go with a 4060 Ti or a 4070. You could also get some pretty good deals on the previous generation 3070 and 3080 from the Team Green side, but on Team Red, a good alternative to the 3060 Ti would be the 6750 XT, which is at similar price point both in the new and used market. Now, for our budget build, as we mentioned earlier, we're going to be going with an AMD Ryzen 5 5600X 6-core 12-threaded unlock processor. This usually comes with a Wrath Stealth cooler in the box, and it's a pretty good deal at the $100 to $120 mark on Amazon. Now for the motherboard, we're using a Gigabyte Aorus X570 Elite board. I've had this thing for over 5 years, and with a BIOS update, it actually supports 5000 series processors. I'd recommend something a little bit more modern like the MSI B550A Pro, which more or less has the same capabilities in terms of supporting PCI Express 4.0, DDR4, and typically brand new. You can get these easy on Amazon for $80. Now for the RAM, we're going to be going with Corsair Vengeance LPX DDR4 16 gigabytes of memory at 32 megahertz for only $30. You could obviously get more RAM if you need it, but for gaming, 16 gigabytes is pretty much a minimum. After that, we're going to be putting in a 1 terabyte WD M.2 SSD drive for only $65. I understand that the PlayStation 5 Pro has 2 terabytes, but you can always add extra storage later down the road, and we want to keep our budget to a minimum. Power supply, you don't need a whole lot of wattage since the 3060 Ti isn't that power hungry, but I would recommend at least 600 or above. This one from Corsair is super reliable, and the newer version is only $55, and I've been running this one for over a decade without any issues. In terms of case, I'd recommend the cheapest case possible. Go on Facebook, try to find something free if you don't care, but a good alternative would be something like this, the NZXT H510. We got this on Facebook for only $40. And you can also get the H5 brand new, which is a similar spec case from NZXT, for under $70 on Amazon. Now the grand total, not including taxes or windows, which you could find for $10 if you want a sketchy key, is about $705. Now we personally got a mix of new and used components, which we have listed out on this table, and it actually cost us about $530 for just the hardware itself. But you can ignore that price point. It's really $700+ if you want to get all this stuff brand new. Next, let's break down our higher end PC, which we didn't get anything used. Everything was bought brand new off of Amazon, starting with our processor. The Intel i5 14600K has 14 cores, 20 threads comprised of 6 performance cores and 8 efficiency cores. It also has integrated graphics, and it can turbo up to 5.3 gigahertz. We're not going to mess around with overclocking too much, so we don't need a very beefy cooler, and plus, since we're dealing with a small form factor case, we don't have a lot of room to play with. So a good low profile cooler is the Noctua NH-L9i. This is designed for the LGA 1700 socket, and it installs really easily and is pretty reasonably priced at $45. After that, for our motherboard, we're going to need an ITX B760. So we're using an Asus Strix version over here that has built-in Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, as well as the latest compatibility for PCI Express 5.0, DDR5, and most of the contemporary USB interfaces such as 3.2, Gen 2x2 for relatively fast data transfer speeds through the USB. Unfortunately, ITX cases always come with a little bit of a premium, and this is certainly no exception. This ranges from about $167 to about $220 on Amazon. Now, one thing that's not expensive these days is RAM. We actually got crucial memory, 32 gigabytes of DDR5 that runs at 6,000 megatransfers per second for only $83. After that, in terms of our storage drive, we're using an M.2 NVMe from AData, 1 terabyte in terms of storage, which isn't a lot, especially these days, but I'm going to be using a network attached storage as well as lots of external drives later down the road, so I don't need a lot of internal storage to begin with. Now, in terms of the GPU that we have, I didn't want to go too crazy by getting an RTX 4080 or 4090, so I went with the 4070 Ti Super from Asus. This is the Pro Art version. This typically ranges from anywhere between $750 to $840, depending upon sales and things like that. This GPU, according to user benchmark, should be around 30% faster than the RX 7800 XT found on the PlayStation 5 Pro, so we should have a pretty decent bump up in terms of performance. And even though this is a fairly large full-size desktop graphics card, we can actually fit it quite comfortably into the Fractal Design Ridge case, which has actually the ability to support up to a 335mm GPU, which is quite a lot shorter than this 4070 Ti, with plenty of cable management. Yes, you are paying a little bit of a premium for the Fractal Ridge at around $130, but it looks great. It's very compact, decent cooling capabilities and overall thermal design, and easy to build with. Lastly, in terms of power supply, we're going to need an SFX unit. So we got a Cooler Master V850. This is a Gold 80 Plus certified. It's fully modular, and it has all the modern capabilities for high power 12 volt PCI 5.0 connection. This POC runs very quiet, cool, and is going to be a great fit in our ITX build. Now, all in all, we paid about $1,580, not including taxes or Windows key. Your prices may vary depending upon sales and where you get all these products. Okay, so with the build stuff out of the way, let's get into our benchmark results. Now, first thing I want to mention is that all the gameplay footage that you're going to look at was captured using the Elgato 4K 60X, recorded in a lossless format through OBS, and the final YouTube video was rendered out H.264 4K 60 at around 80 megabits a second. After YouTube has done processing the video, there's obviously going to be some compression artifacts that I can't personally control, so my apologies for any loss in quality in the final results. Now, to measure the FPS levels, I use Teardrop, which analyzes the lossless footage coming out of the PlayStation 5 Pro, and this isn't exactly 100% accurate, but gives us a good reference point of where the frame rate is at a given point on the console. On the PC, we're just going to simply use MSI Afterburner to display the real-time FPS, and we're going to capture the actual PC footage in the exact same way in a lossless format using the Elgato capture card. So after a few terabytes of footage later, here are the results. The first thing we're going to take a look at is Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. Firstly, I want to compare the fidelity mode of the PlayStation 5 Pro to the maxed out settings on the PC, just to see what the capabilities are on the PlayStation 5 versus the PC. And here's a side-by-side comparison between the RTX 3060 Ti and the PlayStation 5 Pro. The 4070 Ti will just have pretty much the same render quality, but at a higher frames per second, which we'll take a look at later on. But in terms of actual clarity, aspect, and resolution, obviously on the PC we can crank out all the texture details and character and background assets, and we could definitely render out more real-world usable details and resolution. As you can see in the far distant objects, we have a ton of more fine details on building assets as well as the foliage. We can see the individual branches on the trees are very well defined and with a lot more resolution and detail present compared to the PlayStation 5, which generally looks softer even in fidelity mode. And keep in mind that this is recording at the same bitrate, same overall quality settings, and we could definitely see more present detail and resolution on the PC. But one thing I do have to say on the PlayStation 5 is that we have better particle effects with more consistent particles. So in the Confinity, we could track individual Confinity particles versus on the PC, they disappear in and out of existence much more frequently and we have less overall particles. In addition to that, the PlayStation 5 Pro also has better shadow occlusion. If you take a look at the trees in the far distance, we can see better overall three-dimensionality to the shades of different tree colors when things are more in shadow, versus they look a little bit more flatter on the PC side. Yes, we certainly have more data and resolution to play with, but we don't have the same dimensionality found on the console. In addition to that, we can definitely see better character assets in terms of texture details. For example, over here you could clearly see the individual fur in Ratchet's back, as well as his clothing, weapons. Everything just has more fine textures on the PC because it's rendering out much more details, because we can max out those specific texture settings on the PC side to the greater extent, even on fidelity mode on the PlayStation 5. Here's another example using the 4070 Ti, where we can see the tree branches have a lot more resolution to the branches themselves. Same thing with the individual leaves, but as you can see, we definitely have a lot more aliasing issues on the PC side. Now you can mess around with TAA, SMAA, MSAA, FXAA, and pretty much all the settings at 4K definitely look a little bit over sharpened compared to the PlayStation 5 Pro, maybe because the PSSR is doing something to kind of soften those edges. But on the PC side, no matter what I tried in 4K resolution, everything looks a little bit too sharp, especially around corner edges of objects. That's just the case of how this game renders out on the PC side compared to the console. Now, let's talk about frame rate. Ratchet & Clank on the PlayStation 5 Pro obviously runs at 30 frames per second in quality mode or 60 frames per second in performance mode. Most people are not going to be playing in quality mode, even though you get sharper overall resolution details, but 60 frames per second runs solid in performance mode and you get pretty decent details. Effectively, you're running some sort of quad HD resolution, which looks sharp enough on most 4K displays. On the PC side, our RTX 3060 Ti PC got around 40 to 30 frames per second in most environments, with lows of 25 frames per second, and that's the details set to very high and DLSS set to performance in full native 4K resolution. We could definitely improve frame rates by bumping down the detail settings to medium, which gives us equivalent resolution to what we encounter with the PlayStation. And here our frame rate hovers above 60 frames per second with 1% lows of 38 FPS. Now with our build with the 4070 Ti, using 4K resolution, very high detail setting, and DLSS set to performance mode, we're getting well over 100 frames per second on most of our scenes with lows of 80 frames per second. And if you set DLSS off, with no assistance whatsoever, native 4K runs at 60 to 70 frames per second on most of our scenes. Now let's move over to another Insomniac game that's available both on PC and PlayStation, which is Spider-Man Miles Morales. Unfortunately, we don't have Spider-Man 2 available on the PC as of creating this video, but Miles Morales is fairly equivalent, and it is enhanced for the PlayStation 5 Pro. Now in Fidelity Pro mode, you're getting 4K native resolution at 30 frames per second at a solid rate. Performance mode runs at Quad HD, more or less, and runs very smoothly in 60 frames per second. On our RTX 3060 Ti, with DLS set to performance, max detail settings, native 4K resolution, you're looking at an average frame rate of about 73 frames per second and 1% lows of 43. Spider-Man runs great on the PC, and this is certainly no exception with even our lower-end GPU. On our higher-end GPU, the 4070 Ti, in the exact same scene, we're getting 115 to 130 frames per second using the exact same settings, DLSS set to performance, max detail settings, 4K resolution. Now, one thing I do have to also mention is the amount of detail that we're getting on the PC is staggering. Even in the fidelity mode on the PlayStation 5 Pro side, we're seeing a lot more details present on the PC side. Take a look at this side-by-side example. You can see that the water tower on the building over here has a lot more texture details. We can see the individual bricks on the building themselves, which is kind of mushed out on the PlayStation 5 Pro. And again, this is the same render quality, same compression artifacts and everything like that. This is straight capturing from the Elgato capture card, and we just see a lot more resolution. Here's another scene down below on the street side. And here's again the PC set to DLSS, set to performance, 4K native resolution, max details, and we can definitely see those finer details on the PC side. Take a look at the Christmas lights, the individual leaves in this specific scene, as well as all the fine details, and pretty much every aspect of the screen over here is sharper, clear, and more defined on the PC side. Even though this exact sequence runs at 70 frames per second on the PC side, and the scene that you're looking at on the PlayStation 5 Pro is in the fidelity mode, which is locked to 30 FPS. Now on Cyberpunk 2077, I didn't really find a big difference between the standard PlayStation 5 and the Pro variant. The performance still runs at 60 frames per second and renders out a similar Quad HD resolution, and the ray tracing on in the quality mode still runs at 30 frames per second, which hasn't changed. What does our PCs run at? Well, in our RTX 3060 Ti, where we have medium ray tracing settings preset, as well as DLSS set to performance, we're getting an average frame rate around 39 frames per second, with 1% lows down to about 29. The 4070 Ti with the medium ray tracing settings, DLSS to performance, we're getting around 87 to 70 frames per second on the low end, which is super playable at the native 4K resolution. Now the PlayStation 5 set to fidelity mode with ray tracing on still has less present detail in fine distant objects, even compared to the lower end PC. So you can see that over here on the billboard with the screen, we can read out the individual text on the advertisement, and surface texture details on a building, not to mention shadow and occlusion, are a lot more realistic and much better defined on the PC, as you would expect, since this is really a game that's probably best experienced on a PC rather than a console. Now let's move on to Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered. The cool thing on the PlayStation version is that you actually have 3 different graphical modes to play from, either the performance, resolution, or balance mode. Performance mode runs at around the Quad HD resolution at 60 frames per second. The resolution mode gives you native 4K at 30 frames per second, and balance mode is actually what we're playing right now, which hovers around the 40 frames per second mark, which is a great way to experience this game with decent amount of smoothness in terms of overall frame rate and excellent detail that definitely rivals the experience that you're getting on the PC. In fact, I don't think there's really any advantage on the PC in terms of actual resolution and details, especially set into resolution mode. Obviously, in terms of performance mode, especially on the 4070 Ti, we can definitely get much higher frame rate. In fact, you're looking at about 110 average frames per second with max details DLSS set to performance and 1% lows down to around 85 frames per second. On our 3060 Ti, we're looking at 40 average frames per second in the exact same scenario and settings with 1% lows down to about 30 FPS. Very comparable to the experience we're getting on the PlayStation 5 Pro. Now next I want to talk about two of my favorite games on both the PC and console, starting with Doom Eternal. Now this game runs very smoothly, 60 frames per second on the PlayStation 5 Pro, and it's very similar to the experience you're going to get on the standard PlayStation 5 since this game is not inherently enhanced. Now if you have a VRR enabled display, you can certainly get slightly above 60 frames per second, but generally this is a 60 FPS experience on the PlayStation. But obviously on the PC, this game is notoriously very well optimized, and even on our 3060 Ti at 4K resolution in Nightmare mode, which is almost max details, we're getting an average frame rate of 90 frames per second, 1% lows down to 60 with ray tracing off. Exact same settings on the 4070 Ti. This game is a joke at 225 frames per second on average, and 1% lows down to about 143. Next, I'm a huge fan of anti-gravity racing games, and probably one of the best ones ever, I think, is Redout 2. This game is not demanding at all and runs 60 frames per second smoothly at 4K resolution on the PlayStation 5 Pro, and on the PC side, on the RTX 3060 Ti, we're looking at 65 frames per second with epic details, so pretty much maxed out textures, and lows down to about 32 frames per second. This is sometimes a little bit stuttery on PC, but if you do have a very powerful graphics card, you can just brute force your way out of those stutters. And on the 4070 Ti, you're looking at about an average frame rate about 139 in the exact same detail settings, and a minimum of 73 frames per second. One thing I noticed with this game, like all of the PC game titles, since we can max out the texture details, you are going to notice that the PC version resolves a lot more detail, both in terms of vehicle and environmental assets, and that's generally the case when you can max out all your texture settings on the PC side. And I'm not too sure if this is being enhanced using the PSSR on the PlayStation 5 Pro, since this is more of an obscure game that's not officially on the enhanced list, but it definitely is a better experience playing this on the PC than on the console. Now, purely from a gaming perspective, I think the PlayStation 5 Pro is an actually impressive piece of hardware. It gives you a very similar level of resolution while maintaining a 60 frames per second in performance mode that really rivals the experience that you're going to get with a comparably priced gaming PC. In addition to that, with games optimized for PSSR, you're not going to get exactly the same experience found on the PC due to the fact that those games were specifically designed for the PlayStation platform, and it's never going to be exactly the same on the PC. Of course, being a console, there's some inherent limitations in terms of how you can render your games in terms of graphics settings. Most games either give you two settings for either prioritizing quality over frame rate or frame rate over quality. On the PC, you don't really get that kind of compromise. You have way more flexibility in terms of changing your graphics settings. In any given game, you can have almost hundreds of different combinations of graphical settings. Change your assets of texture details, as well as the method of anti-aliasing, super sampling in terms of resolution, as well as frame rate generation and ray tracing capabilities. So you can really optimize your hardware to give you the best overall gaming experience in a given platform. Furthermore, in terms of how the 3060 Ti did compared to the PlayStation 5 Pro, I think it did a very excellent job, especially considering the price point. You're matching in pretty much most titles the overall frame rate as well as detail quality levels that you're experiencing with the PlayStation 5, with some exceptions here and there that are more optimized for the PlayStation platform. But for most cross-platform generic gaming titles, you're gonna either get higher frame rates because it's not capped to 60 or 120 or anything like that. On top of that, if you do want higher fidelity, you can always crank up those resolution and texture details and sacrifice a little bit of frame rate. But really for Quad HD resolution, I don't think bang for the buck, there's probably a better GPU out there in the NVIDIA side than the 3060 Ti. On top of that, if you don't mind buying used, you can easily make this $700 system that we got on Amazon for well under $600 in the used marketplace, whether that's Facebook, Craigslist, or eBay, and have a very capable system for general purpose, whether you're just going to be web browsing or even editing 4K videos alongside doing all your gaming stuff. Now, as far as the higher end gaming PC with the RTX 4070 Ti, you're not going to find too many compromises in terms of resolution and frame rates. And pretty much most gaming titles are getting more than double the frame rate of the PlayStation 5 Pro. And it's only games like Cyberpunk 2077 where we crank up our ray tracing settings and max out all of our details and turn off DLSS, where you might need a more higher end graphics card like a 4080 or 4090, something like that. But you're going to be spending potentially $1,000, $2,000 more for that. And you're probably going to get diminishing returns in terms of overall FPS and general clarity. Now, of course, we could have saved quite a bit of money if we didn't get an ITX form factor, motherboard, and case, probably another $200 to $300. On top of that, if we didn't need as powerful as a CPU, we could have easily gone down to an AMD 5800 or an Intel 12600K processor, saved another $200 there, and probably for around $1,000, we could have had a very similar gaming experience. But for me personally, I needed a more powerful CPU, something that could potentially be used for just general purpose computing, especially 6K or even 8K video editing and things like that. So this is a little bit more versatile in terms of that, but it's always best practice if you want to get the best gaming experience possible to spend most of your money on the graphics card, and everything else can take a back seat to a certain extent, of course. But if you want the best gaming experience, you could definitely save some money by buying used and buying a less powerful CPU and really put everything on to the graphics card. But really, on that, guys, that's really it. Definitely have to know what you guys think of the PlayStation 5 Pro. Do you think it's worth it over a gaming PC? Would you, if you had the choice? Obviously, most people would probably just get a PC because it's a more useful device. But as a dedicated gaming system, I actually think that the PlayStation 5 Pro is actually pretty decent in terms of value, considering the fact that you have almost a $400 graphics card in there on top of being a dedicated plug and play gaming system that you can give anybody, and they'll just hook it up to a TV and they're pretty much good to go, versus there's obviously a lot more faffing around, a lot more hassle while building a gaming PC, let alone trying to find the best deals in terms of individual components and things like that. But that can be fun for some people depending upon what you consider fun is. But if you have any specific questions, love to hear your thoughts. If you haven't done so, we actually have a PlayStation 5 versus PlayStation 5 Pro graphical comparison video. You'll find that in the description down below. If you haven't done so, please make sure you're liked and subscribed, have post notifications turned on, and subscribe to the channel. We'll see you real soon. Take care. Bye-bye.